Have you ever wondered what happens when the glitz and glamour of Hollywood collide with the scrutiny of global philanthropy? Imagine this: a foundation, led by one of the most recognizable couples in the world, celebrated for its promises of change, suddenly finds itself in the middle of a legal storm. The headlines are screaming, whispers are growing louder, and the public is left asking a single, haunting question. Did Archewell, the charitable organization founded by Meghan Markle and Prince Harry, mislead one of the world's most respected philanthropic entities, the Clooney Foundation? It's a question that has the potential to shake not only the credibility of a high-profile nonprofit, but also the reputations of the people behind it. The allegations aren't minor. They involve promises of collaboration that may not have been fully delivered, public statements that may have overstated the partnership, and expectations set at the highest levels of Hollywood philanthropy. To the casual observer, it might look like a minor dispute between two wealthy organizations. But the truth, as we're about to uncover, is far more dramatic, far more complicated, and far more consequential than anyone imagined. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Let's start at the beginning. Archewell was launched with fanfare, a global press machine ensuring that the world knew about its mission. Its founders, Meghan Markle and Prince Harry, spoke about their vision for a better world, one where philanthropy could create tangible, measurable impact. From tackling social injustice to supporting grassroots movements, Archewell positioned itself as a modern beacon of hope. Their messages resonated, reaching millions across social media and traditional media channels. There was excitement, there was trust, and there was, for many, an unspoken expectation. When a royal couple speaks of social change, people listen. But not everyone was convinced. Behind the glossy press releases and heartwarming announcements were complex negotiations with other nonprofit organizations, each with its own rules, expectations, and accountability standards. Among these was the Clooney Foundation, co-founded by George and Amal Clooney. The foundation is renowned not just for its celebrity cachet, but for its hands-on approach to humanitarian work and legal rigor in ensuring that promised aid actually reaches those in need. Their reputation is sterling, built over decades. When they enter a partnership, they expect clarity, honesty, and transparency. And that is precisely what this story brings into question. The first signs of tension began quietly. Internal communications, leaked emails, and statements suggest there were discrepancies between what Archewell publicly claimed and what had been agreed upon behind closed doors. Small exaggerations, some might argue. But when the stakes involve millions of dollars, public trust, and high-profile reputations, even minor misrepresentations can snowball into major conflicts. There were reports of promised programs that never fully materialized, claims of joint initiatives that were, in reality, still in planning, and communications that gave the impression of a fully realized partnership when, in fact, it was still in its infancy. To understand why this matters, consider the ripple effect of these actions. When a high-profile organization is accused of misleading a respected foundation, it is not just a legal matter. It is a public relations crisis, a test of integrity, and a potential threat to future partnerships. Trust, once eroded, is difficult to rebuild. And in the world of celebrity philanthropy, where visibility is everything, a single misstep can lead to months, or even years, of scrutiny. For Meghan Markle, who has already been a polarizing figure in public discourse, this lawsuit adds another layer of pressure. Every statement she makes, every press release issued by Archewell, will now be examined under a microscope. At the same time, the Clooneys have been remarkably careful in their approach. George and Amal are not known for public outbursts. They are methodical, legal-minded, and strategic. Yet the very fact that they have chosen to pursue legal action indicates that informal negotiations, discussions, and attempts at resolution were insufficient. When a partnership goes wrong to this extent, it often points to deeper issues: misaligned expectations, communication breakdowns, and perhaps a lack of due diligence. The question now is, how deep does the discrepancy go? And how much did Archewell know about the promises it was making versus what it was actually delivering? To add another layer of intrigue, consider the timing. This lawsuit comes at a moment when the world is still fascinated by the royal couple, following every move, every statement, and every public initiative. The media is hungry for updates, and the public is invested in every twist and turn. The combination of royal scrutiny, Hollywood influence, and legal stakes makes this story uniquely compelling. It's not just a question of charity. It's a collision of personal brand, public trust, and legal accountability. So far, most of the world has only seen snippets of this drama, headlines, social media posts, and sensationalized summaries. But the documents, insider accounts, and legal filings tell a much more intricate story. They reveal missed expectations, miscommunications, and in some cases, what critics might call misleading representations. For example, there are references to initiatives described as fully launched when they were still in development. Promises of joint campaigns that, according to correspondents, had not been formally agreed upon. Small details, perhaps, but in the court of public opinion, and in legal terms, they carry enormous weight. And yet, there is another side to this story. Archewell, for its part, may argue that these discrepancies are the result of miscommunication or differing interpretations of partnership agreements. Nonprofits often operate in complex environments, balancing media exposure, donor expectations, and internal logistics. It's entirely possible that the intent was never to deceive, and yet the perception of overstatement has created a legal and public relations nightmare. Here, intention versus perception becomes a critical point, raising difficult questions about accountability, ethics, and leadership. Let's pause and consider the human element. Behind the legal filings and press statements are individuals, people who are deeply invested in the success of these initiatives. For Meghan Markle, it's about realizing a vision of impactful philanthropy. For the Clooneys, it's about ensuring that commitments translate into real-world results. When intentions collide with outcomes and expectations clash with reality, tensions escalate. Emotions run high. Careers, reputations, and personal relationships are tested. And the public, eager for drama, watches every development unfold. As this story unfolds, it's important to keep an eye on the subtle dynamics at play. The lawsuit itself is just the surface. Beneath it are questions about governance, transparency, and the pressures of operating a high-profile nonprofit in the global spotlight. It is a cautionary tale about what happens when public figures promise more than they can deliver, or, at the very least, when communication breaks down and perceptions of overstatement take hold. The legal battle may resolve one aspect of the dispute, but the court of public opinion will continue to evaluate, scrutinize, and judge. So what comes next? The case is ongoing, and developments are emerging rapidly. Public statements will be dissected, internal documents analyzed, and social media sentiment tracked. Every move will be magnified, every detail scrutinized. And for viewers, there is a lesson in watching closely. This is a story that is as much about accountability and perception as it is about law. It challenges us to question the narratives presented in press releases, to consider the motivations behind charitable initiatives, and to recognize that even well-intentioned organizations can falter when promises and execution diverge. But perhaps the most tantalizing question of all is this: what exactly did Archewell promise the Clooney Foundation, and what was actually delivered? Were these discrepancies the result of oversight, ambition, or deliberate exaggeration? And how far will the legal repercussions go, not just in financial terms, but in terms of reputation, public trust, and the couple's ability to lead philanthropic efforts in the future? The answers to these questions are not simple, and they will not be revealed all at once. They require digging into correspondence, statements, and insider perspectives. They require analyzing the timing of announcements, the nature of commitments, and the realities of nonprofit operations. And most importantly, they require understanding the human drama behind the headlines, the clash of vision, expectation, and accountability at the highest levels of celebrity philanthropy. As we move into the main chapters of this exposé, keep one thing in mind. This story is far from over. The tension is building. The players are powerful, the stakes are enormous, and the outcomes remain uncertain. Every email, every public statement, every reported misstep could shift the narrative dramatically. The public has only seen fragments so far, and what comes next will likely shock, surprise, and provoke more questions than it answers. And just when you think the story has reached its peak tension, that's when the next revelation hits. An unexpected twist, a document that contradicts public statements, or an insider account that changes the perception entirely. The drama is only beginning. Have you ever wondered what it takes to launch a global nonprofit under the gaze of millions of people who are watching your every move? To understand the story of Archewell, you have to start at the very beginning, before lawsuits, headlines, and viral tweets. A time when the vision was still pure, untarnished by legal disputes or public skepticism. This is where Meghan Markle and Prince Harry's ambition took root, a story of hope, idealism, and, as we'll see, unforeseen complications. Archewell didn't emerge overnight. It was born from years of experience, frustration with existing systems, and a desire to make a tangible difference in the world. For Meghan, who had spent years in Hollywood, and Harry, who had lived his entire life under intense scrutiny as a royal, the decision to start a nonprofit was both personal and strategic. They wanted to create an organization that could harness their influence for good, combining media power, celebrity reach, and financial resources to effect real change. From the outset, Archewell was positioned as a modern nonprofit, different from anything else in the public eye. It was sleek, media-savvy, and digitally driven. Its website emphasized storytelling, using videos, essays, and testimonials to connect with audiences emotionally. The mission was bold: to uplift, to support, and to make a measurable difference. They spoke of tackling social inequities, supporting grassroots initiatives, and promoting systemic change. In interviews, speeches, and press releases, the couple framed Archewell as more than a charity. It was a movement, a new model for philanthropy that combined compassion with action. But every bold vision comes with challenges, and the early days of Archewell were no exception. The couple faced immense pressure to deliver. The world had expectations, the royal legacy of service, the media's hunger for news, and the public's desire for inspiration. Every initiative, partnership, and announcement would be scrutinized, dissected, and amplified. And yet, behind the glossy exterior, there were logistical and strategic hurdles: finding the right partners, defining metrics for success, and ensuring that lofty promises could translate into real-world outcomes. The very first projects Archewell undertook were ambitious. They ranged from initiatives supporting mental health to funding programs for underserved communities. At the same time, there were strategic partnerships being negotiated with other organizations, foundations, and stakeholders who could bring expertise and credibility. Among these partners were well-known nonprofit organizations and philanthropic leaders who had long histories of making a difference on the ground. These partnerships were supposed to ensure that Archewell's impact was tangible, measurable, and sustainable. And yet, the early communications suggest that there was a gap between vision and execution. Some initiatives were announced publicly before they were fully formalized, creating a perception that certain projects were further along than they actually were. Press releases highlighted collaborations that, according to internal correspondence, were still in negotiation or in planning stages. For many, this is a common practice in high-profile organizations. It's called generating excitement and momentum. But when you're under the spotlight of global media and public scrutiny, these early announcements can quickly become points of contention. The couple also faced internal challenges in defining Archewell's identity. Meghan, accustomed to the Hollywood system of promotion and storytelling, emphasized visibility and narrative control. Harry, on the other hand, brought experience from charitable work with his royal initiatives, focusing on tangible impact and operational oversight. Combining these approaches required delicate negotiation, balancing aspirational messaging with operational realities. Any misalignment between public statements and internal progress could, and eventually would, lead to misunderstandings. Interestingly, Archewell's media strategy in these early days was groundbreaking. The organization leveraged social media, podcasts, and strategic partnerships with content creators to share its message widely. They understood that traditional nonprofit models, relying solely on grant-making and reporting, would not suffice in the modern age of attention economics. Every post, video, and interview was designed to build credibility, inspire action, and generate excitement. But the very tools that amplified their reach also magnified scrutiny. A single discrepancy, real or perceived, could become headline news overnight. Financially, Archewell appeared well-positioned. Early funding came from personal resources and donations from high-profile supporters. The combination of celebrity influence and public goodwill created an aura of legitimacy. People believed in the mission because they believed in the founders. And there is a powerful psychological effect at play here. When a figure is globally recognizable as Meghan Markle speaks about philanthropy, trust and admiration often precede verification. The public assumes authenticity, but assumptions, as we are about to see, can be dangerous when legal and operational realities are at stake. Partnerships were central to Archewell's strategy. They understood that achieving global impact required collaboration with organizations that had expertise, networks, and local knowledge. Entering these agreements involved promises, timelines, and deliverables. And while the intent might have been genuine, the clarity of those agreements, or lack thereof, would later become a critical point in the dispute with the Clooney Foundation. Early documents suggest that the language used in public communications sometimes overstated the status of collaborations. It's the difference between a planned initiative and one that is actively operational. In legal terms, these distinctions are vital. In public perception, they can feel like betrayal. At the same time, the couple's storytelling approach created emotional engagement. Archewell's campaigns often featured real stories from individuals and communities that would benefit from funding or advocacy. Videos, essays, and interviews highlighted the human impact, creating a compelling narrative that inspired donations and support. Yet, storytelling also sets expectations. When a story is presented as immediate and actionable, audiences naturally assume results will follow quickly. Any delay, miscommunication, or operational lag can be perceived as a failure, even if it's merely a function of complex project management. As Archewell grew, so did its network of advisors, partners, and supporters. The organization sought guidance from philanthropic experts, legal advisors, and media strategists. Every initiative had multiple layers of oversight, yet the public-facing messaging often simplified these complexities. This simplification, while effective for engagement, carried risks. Oversimplified claims in press releases or announcements could later be interpreted as misleading or exaggerated, particularly by a partner like the Clooney Foundation, which operates with rigorous standards and expects clarity in commitments. It's also worth noting the cultural dynamics at play. Meghan Markle, transitioning from Hollywood to royalty and then into global philanthropy, brought a unique perspective shaped by media savvy, personal experience, and advocacy work. Prince Harry, with decades of experience in charitable work, brought operational knowledge and an understanding of public accountability. Balancing these perspectives required negotiation, strategy, and sometimes compromise. Misalignments, however subtle, would later surface in ways that fueled controversy and conflict. By the time the Clooney Foundation became involved, Archewell was already navigating these operational, strategic, and public pressures. Initial communications between the two organizations were reportedly enthusiastic and optimistic. Both sides believed in the potential for meaningful impact. Yet early correspondence hints at differing expectations, timelines, and definitions of success. These differences, if not addressed explicitly, would later form the basis of misunderstanding, frustration, and ultimately legal action. The genesis of Archewell is a story of ambition, vision, and human complexity. It is the story of two individuals trying to change the world under the scrutiny of millions, using the tools of modern media, celebrity influence, and personal wealth. It is also the story of how even the best intentions can collide with reality, creating friction, miscommunication, and, eventually, controversy. And while the early days of Archewell were filled with promise, the seeds of tension had already been planted. Public statements, optimistic timelines, and ambitious initiatives created a framework that would later be tested by reality. The first cracks were subtle, easily dismissed, but they were there. Small discrepancies in communication, early overstatements of progress, and differing expectations between partners created a situation ripe for misunderstanding. And this brings us to the central tension of the story. When Archewell publicly positioned itself as a fully capable, fully operational philanthropic force, Were they overstating their achievements? Or were they victims of the immense pressure to inspire, mobilize, and deliver under a global microscope? The answer, as the Clooney Foundation would later argue, is more complicated than anyone initially imagined. When you think of George and Amal Clooney, what comes to mind? Oscar-winning films, red carpets, glamorous Hollywood events? That's only part of the picture. Beneath the glitz lies a couple deeply committed to humanitarian work, known for tackling some of the world's toughest crises with a combination of celebrity influence, legal advocacy, and direct action. And it's precisely that reputation that makes their involvement in the Archewell story so consequential. The Clooney Foundation for Justice, co-founded by George and Amal, has a long track record of partnering with organizations that can deliver measurable impact. Whether it's protecting human rights in conflict zones, advocating for justice in international courts, or supporting at-risk communities through strategic programs, the Clooneys operate with precision, accountability, and a high degree of scrutiny. They don't enter partnerships lightly. When they commit resources, time, and credibility, they expect results. And it's this standard that set the stage for a collision course with Archewell. The initial conversations between Archewell and the Clooney Foundation were reportedly enthusiastic. Both sides shared a vision, using their combined influence to drive social change on a global scale. Archewell brought a narrative-driven approach, the ability to capture public attention, and the appeal of a royal-backed initiative. The Clooneys offered operational expertise, legal rigor, and experience navigating complex international partnerships. On the surface, it seemed like a perfect match, a union of visibility and execution, storytelling and accountability. But as with any collaboration between high-profile entities, early optimism can be misleading. According to sources familiar with the discussions, the initial meetings focused on ambitious projects, outlining broad goals such as advocacy campaigns, joint fundraising initiatives, and targeted programs in marginalized communities. The conversations were filled with big ideas, inspirational language, and a palpable sense of possibility. And in those moments, everyone involved likely believed in the potential for extraordinary impact. However, the first signs of tension emerged almost immediately. The Clooney Foundation, operating on years of experience, began to notice discrepancies between what was discussed verbally and what was being presented publicly by Archewell. Emails and internal notes suggest that while Archewell was highlighting specific initiatives as fully operational, the projects were often in the planning stages or contingent upon approvals that hadn't yet been secured. For the Clooneys, whose standard operating procedure demands clarity and precision, these discrepancies were alarming. To add complexity, the public narrative crafted by Archewell painted a picture of seamless collaboration. Press releases, social media updates, and public statements suggested that the partnership was already yielding results. Donors, followers, and media outlets were led to believe that the initiatives were fully implemented and producing measurable outcomes. From a communication standpoint, this approach was effective. It generated buzz, drew attention, and elevated Archewell's profile. But it also created a gap between perception and reality, a gap that would later become the heart of the legal dispute. George Clooney, in particular, is known for his careful management of reputation and messaging. Every statement, collaboration, and public appearance is strategically considered. When discrepancies between Archewell's claims and reality came to light, it triggered serious concern. The foundation began internal reviews, cross-referencing public statements with project timelines, deliverables, and agreements. The more they dug, the more inconsistencies emerged. Some initiatives described as fully launched were still in development. Commitments presented as finalized partnerships were still under negotiation. And perhaps most troubling, there were indications that Archewell's public messaging may have exaggerated these points to maintain momentum and visibility. At this stage, emotions were starting to play a role. While initial discussions had been collaborative, the Clooneys reportedly felt frustration, disappointment, and even a sense of betrayal. Here was an organization they had chosen to trust, one led by a globally recognized couple, presenting themselves as capable and aligned with the Clooney Foundation standards. Yet the emerging reality suggested misalignment, intentional or not. The emotional stakes were high, because in the world of philanthropy, Credibility is everything. Misrepresentation, even perceived, can undermine years of hard work and damage trust irrevocably. It's important to recognize the broader context. For Archewell, collaboration with the Clooneys was more than a strategic partnership, it was a validation. Being associated with one of the most respected philanthropic couples in the world reinforced Archewell's credibility, signaling to donors, media outlets, and the public that this was a serious, high-impact organization. The allure of celebrity partnership can be intoxicating, but it also comes with the responsibility to meet expectations, honor commitments, and ensure that messaging accurately reflects operational realities. This is where the story begins to twist. Internal communications between Archewell staff and external advisors suggest that there were discussions about how to frame joint initiatives for public consumption. The focus was on impact, visibility, and engagement, but perhaps at the expense of precision. It's a subtle distinction, but one with profound consequences. When a nonprofit overstates its progress, it risks not only disappointing its partners, but also entering a legal gray area where claims can be interpreted as misleading or deceptive. And this is exactly what happened. As the partnership progressed, the Clooney Foundation started to formally question the public statements being made by Archewell. Were the timelines accurate? Were the commitments fully agreed upon? Were donors being led to believe that certain initiatives were already producing results? These questions, initially raised in internal discussions, quickly escalated in significance as evidence accumulated. Emails, press releases, and social media posts created a trail that could be scrutinized in ways that were impossible to retract once public perception had been shaped. At the same time, Archewell's media strategy continued unabated. Public announcements emphasized progress, collaborations, and impact stories. Supporters celebrated the initiatives, praising the couple for their visionary approach. The media amplified these messages, sometimes without verifying operational details, creating a feedback loop that magnified the gap between perception and reality. This tension between public storytelling and behind-the-scenes execution set the stage for conflict. The Clooneys, as methodical operators, eventually concluded that informal conversations, clarifications, and private correspondence were insufficient to resolve the discrepancies. The partnership had moved beyond a simple misunderstanding. It had entered a space where legal clarity, accountability, and documentation became essential. And thus, what began as a shared vision of impact slowly evolved into a legal and reputational dispute. It's crucial to understand the human element here. George and Amal Clooney are not adversaries by nature. They are strategic, principled, and measured. Yet the combination of perceived overstatement, mismatched expectations, and operational gaps created a situation where their confidence in Archewell's representation was undermined. Frustration turned into formal concerns, and formal concerns eventually led to legal action. It wasn't about money alone. It was about trust, accountability, and ensuring that philanthropic commitments were honored in practice, not just in words. And then there's the emotional dimension. For Meghan Markle and Prince Harry, this was supposed to be a story of empowerment, impact, and global influence. Partnering with the Clooneys was intended to amplify their philanthropic reach and validate their organizational legitimacy. But the clash of perception and reality introduced tension, defensiveness, and scrutiny at an unprecedented scale. Suddenly, a narrative of hope and progress was shadowed by questions of credibility, interpretation, and accountability. In essence, the entry of the Clooneys into Archewell's journey marked a turning point. What started as a partnership filled with promise became a delicate negotiation of expectations, a test of communication, and, ultimately, a prelude to legal conflict. It illustrates a critical lesson in high-profile philanthropy. Good intentions are never enough. Alignment, clarity, and transparency are not optional. They are mandatory. Without them, even the most well-intentioned initiatives can falter under scrutiny. And just when it seemed that tensions were contained, subtle signals began to appear that would later be pivotal in the unfolding dispute. Miscommunications about deliverables, discrepancies between public statements and internal agreements, and differing interpretations of partnership scope all began to accumulate. These were not glaring errors at first glance, but over time, they built a pattern that would later form the core of the Clooney Foundation's concerns. So, as Archewell and the Clooneys continued their collaboration, the stage was quietly being set for confrontation. The elements were in place. High-profile personalities, ambitious initiatives, misaligned expectations, and public scrutiny. All that remained was the spark that would ignite the controversy, the moment when perception and reality collided in a way that could not be ignored. When does a promise cross the line into a misleading claim? It's a question that sounds simple, but in the world of high-profile nonprofits, it's anything but. For Archewell, that line was about to be tested. And the results would have consequences that neither Meghan Markle nor Prince Harry could have fully anticipated. The claims made to the public, amplified by press releases, social media, and interviews, suggested an impact and partnership that, according to the Clooney Foundation, were not entirely accurate. And that is where the legal and reputational storm begins. The first red flag appeared in the way Archewell communicated the scope of its partnership with the Clooneys. Press materials described joint initiatives as fully operational, fully funded, and already producing measurable results. Headlines celebrated collaboration on mental health campaigns, community outreach, and advocacy programs. Donors were led to believe that Archewell and the Clooney Foundation were functioning as a seamless team, working side by side to achieve tangible outcomes. But according to internal communications and legal filings later made public, several of these initiatives were still in the planning stage. Certain programs mentioned in public statements had not yet received formal approval, funding disbursement was still pending, and operational infrastructure was incomplete. In other words, what appeared as a completed project in public perception was, in reality, aspirational. The difference between intention and delivery may seem subtle, but in the world of nonprofits, especially when celebrity reputations are involved, it is a critical distinction. The Clooney Foundation's concern wasn't simply about semantics. Their mission is built on transparency, accountability, and measurable impact. When an organization publicly claims outcomes that have not been realized, it risks undermining the credibility of all involved. Emails between Clooney Foundation staff show growing frustration. Phrases like misrepresentation of partnership status and overstatement of deliverables appear repeatedly. While the foundation is known for being strategic and measured, the accumulation of these discrepancies raised serious questions about Archewell's communication strategy. To understand how this happened, it's important to consider Archewell's media philosophy. From its inception, the organization embraced storytelling as a core tool for engagement. Videos, essays, and social media posts highlighted personal stories and community impacts. The intent was clear: to inspire action and create emotional resonance. But the effect was that timelines, milestones, and program statuses were sometimes presented in a way that suggested completion rather than progress. For the general public, the difference was invisible. But for a partner like the Clooney Foundation, which evaluates commitments with precision, the gap was glaring. One particularly illustrative example involves a program focused on supporting underserved youth. Public statements indicated that the initiative was already in operation, reaching communities, and providing tangible services. Internal documents, however, revealed that funding approvals were pending and that pilot programs were still being developed. From a legal perspective, this distinction matters. Suggesting that services are being delivered when they are not can constitute misleading representation. From a reputational standpoint, it erodes trust. And when a celebrity organization is involved, the scrutiny is instantaneous and relentless. Another area of tension involved joint fundraising campaigns. Archewell, in its public messaging, described collaborations as fully realized efforts with specific goals and projected outcomes. Yet internal timelines showed that key elements, such as co-branded materials, media partnerships, and verification processes, were still under negotiation. These claims, while optimistic and forward-looking, were perceived by the Clooneys as overstated. The result: a perception that Archewell was exaggerating its operational capacity to enhance visibility, rather than accurately reflecting the status of the initiatives. There's also the emotional dimension. For the Clooneys, these discrepancies were more than technicalities. They felt like a breach of trust. In philanthropy, especially at this scale, trust is currency. Misrepresentation, intentional or not, can erode decades of credibility in an instant. Publicly amplifying claims that are not fully substantiated places partners in a difficult position. Either publicly correct the narrative and risk confrontation, or remain silent and risk being associated with misleading statements. George and Amal, known for their measured approach, found themselves increasingly concerned with how Archewell's communications reflected on their own foundation. At the heart of the issue is the concept of intent versus perception. Archewell's team may have believed that the statements were aspirational, presenting goals as milestones to motivate engagement and donations. From a communications perspective, this approach is common in both nonprofit and corporate environments. But in legal terms, the distinction between aspirational language and factual claims is critical. Public perception does not always differentiate between the two, and when the claims involve another organization with strict operational standards, the consequences can escalate rapidly. One internal Clooney Foundation memo explicitly notes the challenge. The public-facing narrative does not align with our understanding of project readiness. There is risk in continued association without clarification. This line captures the tension perfectly. Even without malicious intent, the misalignment between public representation and internal reality was a source of stress, concern, and ultimately, the rationale for legal scrutiny. The story becomes even more complex when considering the broader public narrative. Archewell had built a brand around transparency, impact, and integrity. Followers, media outlets, and supporters assumed that when the organization announced initiatives or partnerships, these were fully realized or operational. The resulting perception was one of accomplishment and progress. But the truth, as the Clooneys later argued, was more nuanced, and that nuance had been lost in translation, whether intentionally or not. Adding to the tension were statements that implied joint initiatives had achieved outcomes before funding, staffing, and programmatic infrastructure were fully in place. To the Clooneys, who have long emphasized accountability, this misalignment was unacceptable. Emails and legal filings suggest that attempts to clarify or correct the narrative were either delayed or insufficient, further straining the relationship. The public, of course, remained largely unaware of the behind-the-scenes complexities. Social media celebrated the partnership. Headlines praised Archewell's impact and the Clooneys' involvement. Yet, under the surface, the seeds of dispute were already growing. Every public statement that overstepped operational reality added fuel to what would become a highly publicized legal confrontation. It's also worth noting the psychological dimension at play. Archewell, operating under immense pressure to inspire, mobilize, and deliver, may have unintentionally created an environment where overstatement became a defensive mechanism, a way to maintain momentum, attract donors, and project competence. But in doing so, they entered a gray zone, where optimism and aspiration intersected with potential misrepresentation. And this gray zone is precisely where legal arguments find traction. In nonprofit law, especially when partnerships involve external organizations and public statements, clarity, accuracy, and honesty are not optional. Misstating program readiness, exaggerating collaboration status, or implying outcomes prematurely can all constitute grounds for legal action. The Clooney Foundation, with its rigorous approach to accountability, quickly recognized the risk. By the time Archewell issued further public statements, the Clooneys had already begun compiling documentation. Emails, press releases, and social media posts were cross-referenced against internal communications, timelines, and deliverables. The goal was not merely to challenge a narrative, but to establish a factual record, one that could be used to determine whether claims made by Archewell were misleading or overstated. And the most significant factor is this. The alleged misleading claims were not minor or easily dismissible. They involved public perception, potential donor contributions, and the reputational integrity of both organizations. In the high-stakes world of celebrity philanthropy, these are not trivial matters. They are essential. So, as this chapter of the story unfolds, it becomes clear that the misleading claims were a turning point. They transformed a collaborative, hopeful partnership into a source of tension, legal scrutiny, and public interest. What was once a shared vision of global impact became a battleground over language, perception, and accountability. And just when it seemed that clarifications or corrections might resolve the issue, deeper discrepancies came to light. Documents, emails, and statements that revealed a pattern of miscommunication, overstatement, and optimism presented as reality. The partnership, once celebrated, was now fraught with mistrust, legal concern, and the potential for a very public confrontation. When does concern turn into action? For the Clooney Foundation, the answer came not in headlines, but in a quiet, methodical process behind closed doors. Initial frustration over Archewell's overstated claims evolved into formal scrutiny, and what followed would set the stage for a legal showdown that neither party could ignore. It began with internal meetings. Staff members at the Clooney Foundation reviewed emails, press releases, and social media statements, cross-referencing them with project agreements, deliverables, and timelines. The goal was simple: understand whether Archewell's public claims aligned with reality. What they found was troubling. Initiatives described as launched or operational were still in developmental phases. George Clooney, known for his meticulous approach, reportedly expressed disappointment in these findings. Amal Clooney, a human rights lawyer, immediately recognized the legal implications. When a high-profile partner communicates misleading information, it creates not only reputational risk, but potential legal exposure. The foundation began a structured process to gather documentation, clearly outlining the areas of concern. Internal memos contained language like overstatement of partnership deliverables and potential misrepresentation to the public and donors. Every detail was logged, every statement scrutinized. At the same time, Clooney Foundation staff attempted to address the issue quietly. Emails and calls were sent to Archewell, seeking clarification and requesting updates on specific initiatives. The approach was measured and professional, reflecting the Clooney's preference for resolution without public escalation. But responses were either delayed or vague, further heightening concern. Ambiguities in explanations only reinforced the Foundation's growing belief that some of Archewell's public claims were inconsistent with internal reality. The emotional stakes for the Clooneys were significant. These were not minor errors or technical misunderstandings. They involved high-profile public perception, donor trust, and the integrity of both organizations. When you operate at this level, every word matters. A single misleading statement can be amplified globally within hours. Social media and news outlets are relentless, and for the Clooneys, being associated with overstated claims risked undermining decades of meticulous credibility. Publicly, Archewell continued its narrative. Social media posts celebrated joint projects, press releases highlighted successes, and interviews reinforced the perception that the partnership was fully operational. The Clooney Foundation, meanwhile, found itself in a difficult position. Correcting the public narrative could provoke conflict. Remaining silent risked being associated with misleading claims. It was a delicate balance, one that demanded careful, deliberate action. The Foundation's review went deeper. Legal counsel was consulted, and a risk assessment was conducted. Questions were raised. Could Archewell's statements be interpreted as fraudulent or intentionally misleading? What about donors who contributed based on public claims of joint initiatives? While the goal was not initially legal confrontation, the risk assessment revealed that formal action might eventually be necessary to protect credibility, operational integrity, and compliance standards. One particularly sensitive issue involved the language used in press releases. Archewell's wording suggested initiatives were already producing impact. Yet internal documentation showed these projects were still in early phases. For the Clooneys, whose foundation operates under strict scrutiny and precise documentation, this represented a misalignment that could not be ignored. Emails between Clooney staff described the concern bluntly. Statements overstate our involvement and the readiness of programs. Needs immediate clarification. Attempts to clarify the narrative with Archewell reportedly met with limited success. Responses were often broad, emphasizing intent rather than specifics, or suggesting that programs were in motion. From a communication standpoint, this might seem acceptable, but legally and operationally, it was insufficient. The Clooney Foundation needed clarity. Exact timelines, confirmed deliverables, and accurate statements about partnership status. Without it, trust was eroding, and with trust gone, the foundation's willingness to continue collaboration became questionable. Meanwhile, the Clooneys had to consider the optics. Public perception mattered enormously. The last thing they wanted was to appear complicit in a misrepresented initiative. For high-profile nonprofits, perception is inseparable from action. Misalignment can lead to criticism, donor hesitation, and reputational damage that lasts far longer than any legal dispute. Internal discussions emphasize caution, document everything, communicate carefully, and prepare for potential escalation. The decision to escalate the matter into legal channels was not taken lightly. Clooney Foundation leadership weighed several options: continued private correspondence, mediated discussion, or formal legal action. Each carried its own risk, from strained relationships to public exposure. Ultimately, the pattern of discrepancies, coupled with insufficient responses, left the foundation with little choice. Protecting organizational integrity required formal steps. The reaction also revealed the emotional toll. Staff members expressed frustration at having to navigate the discrepancy between public messaging and reality. George and Amal personally understood the high stakes. Not just for their foundation, but for the people who relied on the initiatives, the donors who contributed in good faith, and the broader public who trusted the integrity of both organizations. This was more than a miscommunication. It was a test of accountability, transparency, and ethical responsibility. As the Clooney Foundation formalized its concerns, the internal narrative began to shift from disappointment to determination. Detailed documentation of all discrepancies, communications, and public statements was compiled. Lawyers reviewed press releases and emails line by line. The foundation assessed the risk of potential claims from donors or other stakeholders who might feel misled. Every angle was considered. This was not a reactionary decision. It was strategic, measured, and deliberate. And then came the crucial realization. If informal resolution failed, legal action would not only protect the Clooney Foundation's interests but also serve as a precedent for accountability in high-profile partnerships. In other words, the lawsuit was as much about ensuring transparency and integrity as it was about correcting specific misrepresentations. Yet even in this phase, there was caution. The Clooneys did not want to escalate unnecessarily, understanding that public legal conflict with a royal-backed nonprofit would generate intense media scrutiny. Every action, statement, and filing would be analyzed and amplified globally. Balancing the need for accountability with the desire to avoid sensationalism became a critical consideration. The Foundation's strategy combined documentation, legal consultation, and careful messaging. Internal reports emphasized the need for precise language, clear timelines, and documented agreements. At the same time, staff monitored Archewell's communications, noting every public statement that appeared inconsistent with verified progress. The process was exhaustive, meticulous, and emotionally charged. The turning point came when discrepancies persisted despite private clarifications. Public statements continued to imply outcomes that had not yet been realized. Timelines were misaligned. Commitments were presented as finalized when, internally, they were still pending approval. For the Clooneys, these were not minor infractions. They were signs that informal resolution was no longer sufficient. Formal legal measures became inevitable, and so the Foundation acted. Notices were prepared. Legal counsel was engaged. Documentation was organized to support claims of misleading public statements. This was not an attack. It was a defensive, strategic move to protect organizational integrity, public trust, and the reputations of everyone involved. The message was clear: accuracy, transparency, and accountability are non-negotiable, even in the glamorous, high-pressure world of celebrity philanthropy. When the Clooney Foundation began signaling concerns, the ball was in Archewell's court. How does a high-profile organization respond when a trusted partner questions your credibility? For Meghan Markle and Prince Harry, the stakes could not have been higher. Public perception, global media attention, and the integrity of Archewell itself were all on the line. The response would not only determine how the dispute unfolded legally, it would shape the narrative in the court of public opinion. Initially, Archewell's approach was defensive but measured. Internal emails reveal a flurry of discussions about messaging strategy, legal positioning, and damage control. The organization faced a delicate balance. publicly acknowledging concerns could invite further scrutiny, while ignoring them risked escalating tensions. It's a tightrope walk familiar to anyone operating at the intersection of celebrity and philanthropy, but one fraught with pitfalls. The first response was to emphasize intent and shared vision. Archewell framed the situation as a misunderstanding, highlighting the aspirational nature of its public statements. Press statements emphasized collaboration, progress, and the positive impact of initiatives, without directly addressing the Clooney Foundation's concerns. The language was carefully crafted to reassure supporters while avoiding any admission of fault. But intent alone was not enough. The Clooney Foundation had already begun documenting perceived misrepresentations, and internal counsel was preparing for formal legal steps. Archewell now faced pressure from multiple directions: donors, media, and a partner with a reputation for rigorous accountability. Every word mattered, and the organization had to navigate not only the facts of the situation, but also the optics of high-profile conflict. Internally, Archewell debated strategy. Some team members advocated for transparency, suggesting that clarifying the status of each initiative would rebuild trust. Others warned that too much disclosure could expose the organization to further scrutiny, legal challenges, or negative media coverage. It was a classic high-stakes dilemma: the desire to maintain credibility versus the risk of revealing vulnerabilities. To complicate matters, the public had already formed impressions. Social media posts, interviews, and articles painted a picture of Archewell as a philanthropic powerhouse actively producing results. Any response that contradicted this narrative risked confusing supporters and undermining years of brand building. The organization's communications team had to carefully craft messaging that preserved public confidence while addressing serious concerns behind the scenes. Archewell also leaned on legal counsel to shape its responses. Statements emphasized the aspirational nature of initiatives, noting that programs were in development or planned, without explicitly contradicting prior public messaging. This legal framing was precise, but it walked a fine line. The difference between aspirational and misleading is subtle, and it's exactly that subtlety that would later be scrutinized in court documents and media reports. Meanwhile, media outlets began picking up on subtle tensions. Reports emerged suggesting that the Clooney Foundation had concerns about Archewell's public claims, though details remained vague. For the public, these stories fueled curiosity and speculation. Supporters of the couple expressed doubt and defended Archewell's integrity, while critics seized on the idea of exaggeration or overstatement. The situation was rapidly becoming a narrative battleground, where perception could influence legal outcomes. Archewell's response also involved operational adjustments. Teams were instructed to review all public statements, social media posts, and press releases to ensure accuracy. Partnerships and initiatives were reevaluated, and internal reporting was tightened. The goal was to prevent further discrepancies, demonstrate responsiveness, and signal accountability. These measures, while necessary, were also reactive. A recognition that miscommunications had already created significant reputational risk. Emotionally, the stakes were personal. For Meghan and Harry, Archewell was not just an organization. It was a representation of their vision, values, and legacy. The challenge was not only to address specific claims, but also to preserve public perception of integrity, commitment, and authenticity. Every interview, statement, and social media post became an opportunity and a risk. Missteps could amplify criticism, while careful messaging could reinforce credibility. The tension escalated when reports suggested that Archewell's public statements were under scrutiny not only by the Clooney Foundation, but also by independent observers. Analysts, journalists, and nonprofit experts began comparing public claims with internal project timelines, revealing discrepancies. Each revelation added pressure on Archewell to provide clarity without admitting fault, a nearly impossible balancing act in the glare of global media attention. It's also critical to note that Archewell's response was layered. The organization attempted to engage privately with the Clooneys while simultaneously managing public perception. Emails and phone calls aimed to clarify misunderstandings, propose joint messaging, and reinforce the commitment to collaboration. Yet, the Clooney Foundation's concerns persisted. What began as an internal review had now entered a stage where formal legal documentation seemed inevitable. For the public watching from afar, this dynamic created a narrative of tension, uncertainty, and drama. On one side was a beloved celebrity couple, framed as visionaries aiming to change the world. On the other was a respected humanitarian foundation, insisting on accuracy, accountability, and operational integrity. Archewell's response, carefully crafted but ultimately defensive, became a flashpoint for discussion, analysis, and speculation. The legal dimension of the response cannot be overstated. Archewell had to consider potential allegations of misrepresentation, donor expectations, and reputational risk. Every communication, internal or external, was evaluated for its potential impact on pending disputes. Counsel advised that responses focus on intent, clarify language where possible, and avoid statements that could be construed as admissions of misrepresentation. This legal framing, while strategic, also constrained the organization's ability to publicly defend itself fully. In short, Archewell's response was a complex mix of legal caution, strategic communications, and internal recalibration. It aimed to protect the organization while addressing concerns, but the very measures intended to manage the situation also highlighted the seriousness of the dispute. To outsiders, the silence on key issues, the careful phrasing of statements, and the lack of full disclosure raised questions. To insiders, it was a necessary defense in an escalating scenario where every word carried weight. The tension reached a crescendo when leaked reports suggested that the Clooney Foundation was considering formal legal action. Archewell's leadership faced a stark reality. The dispute had moved beyond miscommunications and private clarifications. The issue now had the potential to become a very public, highly scrutinized legal conflict, with consequences for reputation, credibility, and operational freedom. Every conflict has a tipping point. The moment when disagreement turns into action, speculation becomes scrutiny, and tension transforms into full-blown legal proceedings. For Archewell and the Clooney Foundation, that moment arrived with the filing of formal notices, signaling that private discussions had reached their limits and that the matter would now be addressed in the courts. The legal storm was no longer hypothetical. It had arrived. It started quietly, with carefully drafted letters and notices. The Clooney Foundation's legal team outlined the discrepancies they had identified. Public statements suggesting joint initiatives were fully operational, claims of outcomes that had not yet been realized, and representations that, in their view, overstated Archewell's progress. Each point was documented meticulously, supported by emails, press releases, and internal correspondence. For the Clooneys, this wasn't about creating headlines. It was about accountability, protecting their foundation's integrity, and ensuring that philanthropic promises were truthful and verifiable. The impact of these filings was immediate and profound. While the documents were initially private, leaks began to surface, and news outlets quickly picked up the story. Suddenly, a narrative that had been quietly building behind the scenes exploded into the public eye. Headlines described a high-profile feud between two globally recognized entities. Social media buzzed with speculation, memes, and commentary, and the public was captivated by the collision of royal philanthropy and Hollywood activism. For Archewell, the filing represented a critical juncture. The organization had to respond quickly, balancing legal considerations with public relations strategy. Lawyers advised restraint in public statements, emphasizing that every word could be scrutinized, quoted, and potentially used in court. At the same time, there was pressure to reassure supporters, maintain donor confidence, and preserve the organization's public image. This dual challenge, navigating legal risk while managing perception, created an unprecedented level of tension within Archewell. One of the most critical aspects of the legal storm was the question of intent. The Clooney Foundation's claims focused on whether Archewell knowingly misrepresented the status of initiatives or if discrepancies were the result of miscommunication, optimism, or differing interpretations of operational timelines. Legal teams on both sides began dissecting every statement, announcement, and email, searching for evidence that could support either side's position. The documents revealed a tangled web of correspondence, with each side interpreting language, timelines, and commitments in vastly different ways. The media quickly seized upon the conflict. often simplifying or sensationalizing complex legal and operational details. Headlines framed the story as a royal feud or a philanthropy showdown, which amplified public interest but also increased pressure on both organizations. Social media debates became polarized. Supporters of Meghan and Harry criticized the Clooneys as overly rigid or litigious, while others applauded the foundation's insistence on accuracy and transparency. The story had become more than a legal dispute. It was a narrative tug-of-war, with reputations, influence, and public perception all hanging in the balance. Internally, Archewell faced operational stress. Staff members had to manage ongoing projects while responding to legal inquiries, drafting statements, and coordinating with counsel. Every communication, even internal memos, was scrutinized for potential legal implications. Meetings extended late into the night, with leadership carefully reviewing each detail to avoid mistakes. The atmosphere was reportedly tense, with a heightened awareness that any misstep could escalate the situation further. The Clooney Foundation, meanwhile, maintained a disciplined approach. Their communications were precise, measured, and focused on documentation. Public statements emphasized accountability, transparency, and integrity, framing the issue as a matter of principle rather than personal conflict. Behind the scenes, their legal team continued to compile evidence, track communications, and prepare for potential court proceedings. Their strategy was methodical. Establish factual clarity, demonstrate patterns of misrepresentation, and ensure that their foundation's reputation